issue of conservation is something, which at least I personally was introduced sometime in early 80s and I would say late 70s. At that time, I think my beginning was something which was dealing with essentially documentation. And through documentation, to understand the built heritage. So essentially we were dealing with historic structures, but my attention was really focused on the cities, you see, because of my training in Europe. And we were asked to really study the architecture which is in a sense, contained within these settlements and the environments of the cities, because this is something which had to do with people directly. So my studies actually began in a sense quite individually, and the only idea was to really try and figure out my own preparedness to understand architecture by simply confronting it. And the only way to confront was through measuring the building, touching the building, understanding how it is built, understanding what kind of materials people use in their context, and what kind of needs actually really are provided within the buildings, which are actually the fundamental basis for architecture. So with this kind of a journey, I began sometime in 78 to study the city of Ahmedabad, the historic city of Ahmedabad, you see, because Ahmedabad was also something which was at that time considered to be a very progressive city. And from our education in Baroda, we actually thought it the best idea to come to Ahmedabad and join architectural practice and study the new developments, which were actually coming up in Ahmedabad, and be part of that. But with it, came also an opportunity to work with very prestigious kind of projects. And having done that, you see, one once again went into academics and started working with the academic institutions, where the task was also to instruct the students and prepare yourself to intervene in their studios, also to sensitize them about the built environment of the city. So this naturally led me to somehow focus more on the city and develop some kind of a personal learning which one can share with the students. So this kind of a process went on, and then some kind of professional work in terms of academic assignments started coming in, because the School of Architecture at that time was also coming up, and it was a new kind of an institution with lot of openness and ideas from West being also sort of accepted for education. So at that time, when we started working as instructors in studio, this whole idea of looking at our own history became very important for us. Now, UNESCO began the entire issue of conservation sometime in mid-20th century and established the World Heritage Convention with an idea to somehow protect the important heritage world over. And they tried to sort of interact with the nation members of UNESCO, and they developed a separate section on World Heritage. Having done this, UNESCO also financed, in various countries, studies which were related to culture. and its influence on architecture. And one such study came in the hands of School of Architecture, Ahmedabad, focusing on the old city of Ahmedabad to examine the cultural influence on the architectural expression. And one such project was given to me to handle. So that's how my in a sense, serious commitment began on the studies of the old city houses. And this monograph was submitted to UNESCO in 1980. And since then, my interest in the city grew significantly. And I also, in a way, came into contact with Municipal Corporation of Ahmedabad. The Municipal Corporation in Ahmedabad was a premier institution established for city governance almost in 19th century by the British. And it had a long tradition, of really looking after the city. British agency also invited Patrick Geddes at the turn of the century, in early 20th century, to look at the Indian cities, because most of the historic cities were under the process of growth. And the British were very concerned about the preservation of the historic cities. So they wanted Patrick Geddes to come in and help the agency in actually advising the agency on the planning of the new cities, which were really coming out as a kind of growth from the historic city. So Patrick Geddes came to the Bombay Presidency. He went to cities like Indore and in Madhya Pradesh, in many other cities, also in Baroda and in Ahmedabad. And at that time, I think the corporation really took the efforts to follow up with his recommendations and try to work on the protection of the historic city. So the entire issue of preservation has been in the mind of Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation, and I think in that sense the corporation was quite conscious of the heritage of the historic city. So the beginnings were there. Plus, there were individuals within the city, who were historians, literary figures, chroniclers, and also demographers, who worked essentially in documenting the city of Ahmedabad. And several volumes came out in Gujarati language to record the importance of the history of the city and its monuments, its settlement areas. And they also, in a sense, helped the corporation as well as the census to somehow take up from there on and work further on this. So as late as 1962, I think the census of India laid tremendous emphasis on the city of Ahmedabad. And they came up with the special report on Ahmedabad city, as well as a special report on wood carvings of Gujarat. Now these two documents were extremely instrumental as coming from Census of India, which actually even recorded the existence of old houses with wood carving in Ahmedabad, and they established all the different information about who owned the house, how old it is, what were the key characteristic features of woodwork. So all this is something which actually piled up a lot of information on the history and heritage of Ahmedabad. And this was something which was also instrumental for me to study in late 70s, So I think there was a kind of continuous process on the side of municipal corporation and the institutions within the city like School of Architecture to continuously focus on the heritage of the old city. In the School of Architecture, there were also other faculty members, who really helped in, maintaining this focus. And many students really came out with important studies on individual houses and came up with a lot of diploma dissertations on the buildings in the old city, which were residential. So School of Architecture today has a tremendous repository of studied, sort of examples of the historic city. So with all this as a background, and then few more projects coming with the municipal corporation on urban conservation from Ford Foundation, and then there was this, cooperation with the French government at the time of 50th year of India's independence. The speed for focus on the heritage conservation was really enhanced, and I think I used to always sort of work with corporation as some kind of an advisor, but out of it, just some kind of a consultant, and including with the French project. I was working very closely with them, and they came out with tremendous amount of work, which actually was a huge effort on their part, and they identified, exemplary buildings in the historic city. They also updated the maps, which were there with the municipal corporation, and some of them were very old, but normally in this kind of, organizations, the idea of upgradation is rarely taken up. So this was a great opportunity, for us to somehow do that. And then in 2007, I was invited by CEP to start a conservation program, and we wanted to really develop this program as something different from what was happening in India at that time. There were several, institutes who were having post-graduation in conservation, but what I wanted to really focus was on architecture as well as settlement. So this was a kind of combined focus, depending on the interest of the students, and we worked out a course outline, which included humanities, which included structural engineering and sciences, which go with the, restoration kind of works, and we had a huge component of history. And studio was the main focus, So studio actually was something which every student was taking in the post-graduation in 4 semesters, and all other subjects were actually complementing to the studio work. So that was the way this was really going on, and I got this entire coursework first vetted through Sir Bernard Filden, who was actually a British conservationist, and he was world renowned, and he was coming to India as a kind of consultant and advisor to INTAC. And I had, sort of long relation with him, spanning from early 80s, and he sort of acted for me as a peer whom I can really consult. And he was extremely well versed with conditions in India, because in his earlier days he actually was working with the Bengal Regiment as a British sort of individual, and he had spent number of years in India. So I think he was very well versed with Indian situation. So he vetted the course that I prepared, and then, it was a big confidence booster for me, to work with this. And I accepted Ahmedabad's historic city as the laboratory for my course. So each student and all our studio programs were actually focused on the old city. So that, starting from 2007, gave a huge kind of boost on our studies on the historic city. So with all this background, and beginning the course in CET, I also got more opportunities to interact with people like people from ASI, from UNESCO, and we were also helping UNESCO and ASI in many ways, including into their own work, for submitting this kind of a dossier for Rankiwa. We had the first seminar at their request to sort of work out some strategy for dossier preparation. And then UNESCO, we were working with them on several things. For example, they used to sort of consult me for their activities in the areas of culture in India. And we were discussing IHCN's establishment, we were discussing about their intervention with the National Association of Students of Architecture. So the program head for culture at that time, was constantly in touch with me. And in one such meeting here in my office, she actually came up with an idea that we were discussing this in 2009, and she said, why don't we really celebrate the 600th year of Ahmedabad city and try to work for World Heritage status. And I sort of thought that is something, which is really the best thing to do, to celebrate 600 years. So we went to the commissioner, and the commissioner at that time was extremely positive. So he immediately picked up the idea, and we started, thinking about this. So the best way, with the help of UNESCO, was to go with this idea in 2010, which was the next World Heritage Day coming in April. So we said that we should have an international conference on World Heritage in Ahmedabad, so that actually sets off the idea in motion. So we did that, and then I think this conference was held here in Ahmedabad in April 2010, and it was then that the application to submit the tentative list nomination papers to UNESCO was given by our then Chief Minister, and the corporation worked out this letter, and the Director General of ASI was here, Director of UNESCO was here, and in their presence the Chief Minister handed over this letter of application, which was accepted. And then the whole idea of preparation of tentative list nomination came up. So I think in the conference itself, the commissioner assigned me the task, of really preparation of this dossier. And I took this project in my Center for Conservation Studies, which I had established, and took this task up, because at CEPT University, students can also benefit from this, faculty can benefit. So I really started by, picking up the help from the faculty and students, because that was a big strength for me in doing this, because these kind of works are always multidisciplinary and they are teamwork. And I think one individual can spearhead the entire thing, but I think ultimately one needs this kind of help, and that help and support was available both from the municipal corporation in terms of funding the project, and from the CEPT in terms of intellectually providing all the kind of facilities that one needs, including setting up an office and working like this. So in the process of 7 years that I worked on this, there were about 40 architects and students working with me, at different period of times. And I had set up, advisory committees, for this, from the experts from all over the country. And I had a small committee of our deans of the CEPT University, who were sort of also interested in advising to a certain extent. And then the Ministry of Culture also had an advisory committee on World Heritage matters. So this committee's role was essentially to sort of handhold and guide, because this was the first experience in India to apply for World Heritage. So no one had earlier done any dossier for this, so I was the first one to begin this. So there was a lot of help coming from ASI, from this advisory committee, in terms of putting things in a way which was acceptable to UNESCO, because these agencies were directly in touch with UNESCO. And UNESCO also expected in a very structured manner the entire dossier presentation. And they had identified issues, which were actually necessary to highlight. And so it was very necessary to get this kind of inputs from those who were actually anchoring this entire activity for the country. So this is how, the whole thing began and went through the processes. And, when I started working, it was something, which was a huge and a complex task, because we had to virtually resurvey the entire historic city, because there were records, which were not updated. There were information gaps, which were existing. So in order to prepare a dossier, the first task was to really study the entire old city, which meant that it was something like an area of 5.5 square kilometer, and it had over 65,000 buildings, to sort of survey and study. So my team of the architects, who were from all over, I mean, they were not just from Ahmedabad, but from all over, many of them were part of my course. So all these people fanned out in the city and we worked out the complete, process of how one is going to go about doing this. So as a result of all this, we started compiling information on the city. And then after doing substantial work for almost 2 years on this, we actually, started work on compilation for the dossier. Because then we had material on hand. We had already surveyed what kind of areas, which should go for heritage conservation, what kind of buildings should really go for heritage conservation. So we had inventorized everything, So this is what happened. And in this entire, process, a lot of help came from the heritage, because the old city was extremely unique, perhaps in the entire country, because the one fact was that it was a continuously living city from its inception. And the other fact was that Sultanate history of its foundation and, settling up went for almost 150 years from early 15th century. During this period, all the important monuments were built by the sultans. And there are 28 such monuments within the old city which belong to Archaeological Survey of India, because these are under their protection. So, since Archaeological Survey of India also regulates the areas around their monuments, almost 70% area was under control of Archaeological Survey of India. Now that's a unique situation for any city, because when it comes to municipal corporations, work, the entire affair becomes a kind of connected with ASI. So we were trying to develop a very, very solid kind of cooperation between ASI and AMC, because otherwise it was very difficult to handle. So one idea was to really, create this kind of a mechanism, which is also not existing anywhere. So there were so many challenges, which were there. Then, because the city was continuously evolving, and it was actually for a long time an economic hub of this side of the country, the progress was inevitable. I mean, the evolution was constant, it was continuously going on. So the way city kept on evolving, it also developed problems related to growth and change. So these were the areas which we wanted to also document as some kind of threats, to conservation. We had an ongoing cultural tradition, which actually resulted in this city, which started from even Sultanate era, the settlement patterns, which were really started from that era, are the ones, which survived. So the plotting, for example, of the old city was something, which was the most important heritage, because this plotting of individual properties within the old city was something which was from Sultanate period, and it was a result of tremendous agreement between communities, and their members. So there was a very strong, sort of reflection of the attitudes and agreements of the community in the settlement patterns, So this we consider this as a tremendous heritage to be preserved, and thankfully this kind of patterns have survived over 600 years. There are many examples of the earlier kind of land parceling, which is unique. So we actually even surveyed this, and we found out that there was a tremendous uniformity in terms of sizes, and this reflected in the timber construction, because timber construction also limited certain dimensions for spanning, because timber was available like a sort of out of the kit, because certain spans were available depending on the sizes of wood available. So all this really went together so well that it itself became a reflection of the attitude of the construction, use of material, the kind of needs that people had, and the kind of agreement that were there in the communities. Because each community was controlled by their nobles. So this was also something which actually helped in developing an institution of Mahajan. Each community settlement also had their own internal organizations which managed the communities. So there was a kind of elected representative, unit, which was known as panchayat. So this is something, which was also within the community. So there were so many such lessons, which we really learned from the idea of settlement and why it really came up in a particular way, that it virtually exemplified a very sort of endogenous, city and culture, because I think this endogeneity of culture is something, which allows for evolution and continuance of tradition, keeping in mind the importance of the culture of the communities. So that was a great lesson which we thought we had to really project. The second part was the wooden architecture. You see, the way communities expressed themselves individually in their own houses, and the way they wanted their houses to also reflect the culture of their community at individual level. And there was a kind of matching crafts community which was existing here, which were patronized by the people. So as a result of all these favorable situations, I think Ahmedabad really grew the way it has grown, and it was for us to bring out these qualities and values as our outstanding universal value, because UNESCO always looks for this justification that any city, when you take up, it must be able to offer certain values which can be cherished universally, because anybody who comes here and looks at this heritage, it must evoke in their mind the intrinsic connection of culture with this expression. So we identified, UNESCO has several categories in which you can say that our values belong. So we identified, there are 10 criteria, you see. So there are first 6 criteria which deal with the built environment, and then there are 4 criteria which actually deal with natural environment. So we actually took the idea of historic urban landscape, because this is the kind of approach which since last few years UNESCO is highlighting in examining the cities, because it is now really understood even by UNESCO and the World Heritage Convention that when we talk of cities, we have to talk of people, we have to talk of their culture, and we have to see the built environment as a reflection of this. So this historic urban landscape approach takes into account, the entire ecological setting of a city. It just doesn't talk about buildings. It just doesn't talk about crafts. It just doesn't talk about the people in isolated manner. But it talks about city from the point of view of its topography, its locational importance, its landscape in terms of its resources for water, the vegetation around. So it actually allows you to put the entire city in the context of the region in which it is really developed, of which people are the most important part, because they are the ones for whom these cities are established. And it is their economic dependence on that which actually thrives it, So I think this was the way in which we then started working on. And having established or having adopted the kind of value that we want to project, we worked out the entire dossier. Because whatever we do, there were 9 chapters in the dossier. So the 3rd chapter deals with the justification of outstanding values, and in which there are several categories, which we had to really detail out, including by giving the illustrations. We had to also submit the inventory of the important buildings. So this was another process, which actually went parallel, and it had to be sort of screened by number of people, authorities, because when it comes to assigning grades to a property, once again it becomes a kind of issue where multiple opinion counts, not just single. So there were so many areas where we had to work as a kind of team and sort of project this. So starting from our studies, then working on the entire thing as a proposal, and then reflecting on everything as something which is emerged from people's culture. So this was the entire area on which we went. Now as far as the issue of conservation is concerned, I think there are 2 ways, because having established the value and having got it accepted, we had to also really propose a kind of heritage management plan as to how we are going to maintain this, and what is the kind of systems that you will develop apart from municipal corporation to look at this. Because once this is inscribed, UNESCO also expects the city authorities to put up a World Heritage Secretariat, which will directly deal with the city and which will have its own authority. So it is not just the corporation or its routine, working that will look after this, but there will be people assigned. So this entire management system was also part of the working of dossier, where all other experts also helped, including municipal corporation officials. And this is the area where the UNESCO would want the city to commit. So there is a totally sort of substituted, I would say, department which has its own manpower, which includes conservation experts, and this is the body which is now put in charge of looking at the heritage and its maintenance. So this is the way the whole system now works, and we also have established a separate trust, which is known as Ahmedabad World Heritage City Trust. So this trust is emerging as an enabling body for municipal corporation, but its terms of reference will be to entirely look after the heritage. And this trust will have heritage department functioning under itself. It will also have an advisory body, and the entire issue of, and it will also have people's representation, which is already there within the trust. So there are representatives of people who are eminent citizens of the old city. They are also made part of this. The Jain and Muslim communities, who are also very instrumental in the city, their representatives are also part of this. So it's a kind of, multifaceted, multi-level sort of organization which is now set up. So corporation is now quite serious about it, and I think it is going ahead with this idea. So this is what is now the future. Now in terms of the difference that we look at it here is that conservation in the city is going to be a task which will have to be very seriously dealt with, because the city has, if you see the historic city, it has so far been growing on its own. There were not much control so far, because in municipal corporation also, the entire issue of development plan is assigned to a larger authority, which is known as Ahmedabad Urban Development Authority. So the entire issue of the development of the historic city until date was coming under this authority. So they were the ones who were actually planning. But so far there were no serious development plan with the basis of conservation worked out for the old city. So this is what we are now doing as part of the management plan. And we are involving the National Institute of Urban Affairs in Delhi to help us on this. So corporation will have its own team, where planners will be there. And this agency, which is a national level agency, which will have a better coordination with the center as well as the state, and it will advise the municipal corporation to develop this conservation plan. Now when we do this, we have number of factors which we have to consider. The first and foremost is about the people, because whenever you see these kind of historic cities, if they are not cared for in its process of growth, there are certain natural, sort of, I would say, natural, damages, I would say. The first and foremost is about the infrastructure within the historic city. So that is our first. We have to also see how people don't migrate, the owners, because looking at conservation without the original owners is something which is meaningless. It will not click, because those who live in must have a sense of pride, and those who are there right now, they have a tremendous sense of pride. But there is also a kind of in-migration, because many people left for want of better facilities, outside. So this is the first, concern, that how to make people once again feel confident in the authorities in order to offer them comparable services, that one has in the western side of the city or anywhere else outside the historic city. So the first thing is, dealing with people and stopping the excessive commercial pressures within the city. Second is, because of these commercial pressures, there is a tremendous transportation ingress in the city. So today traffic is one of the worst challenges in the old city, and because there were depleting levels of public infrastructure facilities within the city, people preferred to migrate to better areas. So once again, to restore this to a comparable standards is the second. The third could be how to develop a mechanism to look after the houses which are abandoned, which are dilapidated, which are in urgent need of repairs. So this is another important issue which corporation will have to take care, because there is also this question of rented properties, which are there, and obviously these tenants are for decades, some of them are for centuries even, and they pay extremely paltry kind of sum. So for the owners, there is no way to maintain these structures. So there is a kind of also a mechanism we are trying to develop to review these kind of taxation and rentals and all the legislations which are there to provide. The corporation has already decided to provide what is known as transferable development rights. So that is a kind of plus point, but that also has to be something which has to be tied up with the original owners of the properties. So this is something which one step is done, but I think there are many more necessary. So the trust will work on all this now, and the conservation plan will look at all these different aspects. Also to control the land use, you see, because I think it is very easy for people who move out to rent their properties, and when they rent it to a commercial enterprise, they get much better rents. And the commercial enterprises turn these properties into anything that they want, including godowns, which are actually creating a huge security risk for the old city. So these are many issues, which we are now sort of, trying to tackle with the help of this conservation plan which is being worked on. So there is this thing, which is very important from the point of view of conservation. The other thing that we are starting is within the trust, we will also have a sort of building resource center, which will actually carry the know-how and resources for helping people who would like to repair, restore their houses. It will also have a cell which will continually keep monitoring the conditions in the old city. It will also have a laboratory, to sort of do material surveys and things, checking and all that. They will also have structural engineers as advisors. So it is some kind of an in-house capacity building, for the people who would like to get help in maintaining their properties. So this is one, and along with that, it will also have a unit which is working in the area of public awareness. So they will keep, sort of developing workshops, school children oriented programs. So all these activities also will be, they are already going on, but you see they are in a sense not under a common umbrella. So this is something, which will then be put under a common umbrella. So this is something, which is also happening at the city level. And I think after this inscription, there is a tremendous sense of, pride with politicians and people. And I think also amongst the officials, so I think they are all now charged up to do this. So, for example, the town development department and the revenue department of the municipal corporation, they are now involved really afresh, in conducting month-to-month surveys, and to identify areas of urgent repairs, houses, which are locked. So there is a kind of increased activity even in case of municipal corporation. So this is just the current scenario, which is really happening in the historic city and in the areas of further work after the inscription. The another interesting sort of fallout of this inscription is also a kind of nationwide, awareness and inquisitiveness about World Heritage cities, And many cities are really now thinking that if it was Ahmedabad, why not ours? And the question is really valid. And as a result, I am personally being invited to talk about this. And there are other people also, for example, the chairman of Heritage Committee in the Ahmedabad city. So there are many areas where people are called to talk about, who were sort of involved with the Ahmedabad experience. So I was called in Calcutta, and there is a wonderful group in Calcutta called CAL 2016, So I had a presentation to the members of this group and also the other professionals in Calcutta. And Calcutta has also started now a kind of movement to sensitize the state government to support, and also Calcutta Municipal Corporation to support the activities related to heritage conservation. Recently I was also invited in Baroda, because Baroda also has a very sensitive heritage trust, and professionals who are interested, including the MS University Department of Architecture. So there also they wanted to really know how Baroda can take a lead from this and prepare itself. So in Baroda, I think being a smaller city, they have, the commissioner there is very interested, and he is also in a sense very committed to do something for the heritage of the city. So in Baroda, I think they have already started work on the first step, which is towards preparing an application letter, to be submitted to the UNESCO. So the commissioner is also extremely enthusiastic about this, and they are starting this. In Varanasi, there is a kind of an NGO, which has been working on Varanasi city and its heritage conservation for almost 40 years. And I think this NGO has also, invited me there in December to somehow discuss with them as to how, this heritage of the city could be projected, beyond. Because on Varanasi, currently there is a lot of, interest. And Varanasi, of course, is one of the most important cities, in the country. And why not, So I think there are similar many other cities, you see, but as a part of this kind of experience sharing program, I am now requested by there is a huge alumni association of the Faculty of Architecture in CEPT, because CEPT is almost now 55 years old, and it has a huge body of alumni. So there was a meeting with them recently, and the alumni are spread all over India, and they are working in many cities, as important professionals. So they have requested me to undertake a series of such lectures, starting from Ahmedabad and then to Delhi, then to Chennai, Bangalore and Bombay. So I am also trying to do that kind of a, travel to talk to people, So these are the fallouts, you see, because of the inscription.